Curranbhatia here with Marty Corwin. You know him as the director of Top Rank Boxing, so much other great work, and now the author, Arum and King, 6 decades of boxing gold. Marty, how are you doing, first of all?
I'm doing great. It's been a bit of a wild ride. I'm really happy the book is coming out, but I'm doing great.
Well, I want to talk to you about the book, but I want to talk a little bit first about your journey and everything you've achieved in TV.
Right.
When we first spoke, I had checked on your LinkedIn and your resume, and I saw something interesting. George Washington University, class of 1980, and what I expected to see was film production, film school. I saw zoology and chemistry, so right. I was blown away. So tell me about the moment you decided to pivot away from that and decide to dedicate your life to TV.
I was pre-med. I was going to medical school. From 5th grade on, I was going to medical school. And I was a zoology chemistry double major. And like every boxing director, right? And in my senior year, I decided I didn't know that I wanted to go on to med school.
Okay.
I was kind of burned out from all the studying and everything else. And my parents, instead of kicking me in the tail and saying, no, you've been working your whole life towards this, yep. They said, we'll support you on whatever you do, so I didn't go to medical school.
Okay.
And television was just kind of a fluke, because I wasn't ever looking at television, and I wasn't really a sports guy. So if you had told me in college that I'd wind up producing boxing for 40 years in television, I wouldn't have believed you. Interesting pivot.
Yes. For sure. No, definitely an interesting pivot. So you decided to enter this world. You weren't a sports fan originally.
Right.
You became one very quickly, I take it. Or are you still not a sports fan? I know you work in it, but do you consider yourself a sports fan now?
Yeah, absolutely. But before boxing, I spent 12 years working for Viacom and Paramount, producing 110 games a year in the NBA, NHL, and Major League Baseball. Okay. So really my sports producing and directing started with that. I was on the road with the Washington Bullets. Kids today don't know who they are. They're now called the Wizards. Yep. And I did the Capitals hockey and Orioles baseball. And that's what I was doing when I got a call from Don King, who needed a new TV producer and I was only his second producer. His first producer was injured, couldn't return to work. And they called me, and there's a funny story in the book about the long process of getting interviewed and getting hired by Don. I didn't even know I took the job.
That sounds about right in terms of the stories you hear about Don King. I want to ask you about that, but let me ask you about just the success you've had in this industry. You mentioned something there that stuck out to me. Someone else couldn't make it, and you had to put yourself out there and be ready, right? Stay ready so you don't have to get ready, almost in a way. How important do you think that is? Saying yes to those opportunities when they come, and just being ready and ready to take on challenges when you don't know exactly what the outcome's going to be.
I say to my kids, and I have for their whole lives, that you don't know what's going to happen next. Yeah. Keep your eyes open. Don't say no right away to things that you don't really fully comprehend, because you never know. Just keep an open mind. Yeah. Look at what's around you and plan for things, but don't assume that you know exactly which way you're going to go and which path you're going to take. I certainly didn't expect to get into sports television or boxing. I really wasn't a boxing fan of any kind as a youngster. Yeah. So that was a real new twist for me. You got to keep an open mind. You don't know which way you're going to turn. I certainly didn't expect to spend 44 years in television, 30 plus in boxing.
Wow, that's an incredible achievement. That amount of time in this sport, with so much, there's so much going on in boxing in terms of there's fragmentation and different networks and different players, but a few constant players that have been around so long and are still around today, Don King and Bob Arum. So Don, you mentioned Don King giving you the call. We've all heard stories about Don King, the larger-than-life personality, right? The hair and the flag, and had the reputation to get his fighters paid in certain situations. Also, a ruthless businessman as well, and that's been well documented. What was your experience like working with Don King?
Yeah, the reason I did the book on both of these gentlemen, besides the fact that I admire both of them for their accomplishment, Don for a few decades and Bob Arum for 6 decades, is that when I started with Don King, he was nothing like I expected. Okay. First of all, he's one of the smartest men I've ever met, and that really caught me by surprise. He's a brilliant businessman, and he works 15 hours a day, every day. Didn't take days off, holidays, vacations. The man just works around the clock. Unbelievable work ethic. Bob Arum also. That's one thing they both have in common. The work ethic and the hours they put in.
Yep.
But Don was a brilliant guy who then kind of puts on a little bit of the character when he gets out in public. My wife, who has her accounting degree and a law degree, and she worked for Price Waterhouse in the tax division in Los Angeles, and worked with some of the most high-powered CEOs in LA. I tell you that because she had experience that made this important for her. She met Don King, and she heard him at a press conference. She was in the back row of a press conference, and she heard him doing business. She said, he's like a Fortune 100 CEO. And then all of a sudden, Bob, he had to get up and do a press conference, and he transformed into, only in America, don't ever forget it.
Yeah.
So Don is two different people. Bob Arum, however, I found to be the same guy on or off camera. Bob has been like one of my favorite uncles, and he is the same genuine guy, either way. Now, I'm aware of the controversies that these guys have, and I don't ignore them in the book. I talk about them factually. But the point of the book for me is that I consider promoting to be one of the hardest jobs imaginable.
Yeah.
And I wanted to share what these guys have accomplished because I think it's worth our respect and our admiration for what they did achieve. And that's really what I wanted the focus of the book to be, not just the controversies.
Two men who have just put their footprint on a sport, right? This sport would be totally different without the contribution of two men. And so you have to respect just the longevity of it and also the relentless nature that both of them had. You mentioned a little bit about Don King and kind of the perception versus the reality, and you said he puts a showman almost in a way, and you need that in boxing because a lot of boxing, especially now more than ever, is marketing, the marketing aspect, right? Over-the-top marketing can help sell a fight, especially when you're promoting things that are on pay-per-view, which means people have to decide to spend a lot of money on a product, and so you need marketing.
Curating helps.
Yes, exactly. And so for Bob Arum, though, you mentioned he's the same person, behind the mic as he is in front of, all of that. And one thing I wanted to ask you about Bob Arum, not just his longevity. I mean, he promoted Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Leonard, and so much, De La Hoya, and just it goes on and on and on. Obviously, more modern day Manny Pacquiao, right? Legendary promoter, and he's worked with fighters from all around the world. There's a relentless nature, though, to Bob Arum. Even at his 90s, he was here today at this press conference, right? He's not even slowing down in a way, it seems like.
He comes to every show, and he's there for the first fight, not just the main event.
Right. And so I want to, if you could speak to just that relentless nature of his and that work ethic. I mean, for Bob Arum, where does that come from, and how does he sustain that?
Well, as I said, one of the similarities between the two men is the work ethic. Bob Arum is in the office every day. At 92, he's in the office every day. He works his heart off. And to be a promoter, as difficult as that job is, you need to work around the clock. You have people negotiating with you in the middle of the night and every day, weekends, holidays. There's no off time really for a promoter. People see a promoter get in the ring after a fight or at a press conference. They think that's the job.
Right.
That's a minuscule portion of the job, being on camera. So that they have in common, the work ethic and the hours they put in, and what they've achieved in getting past obstacles and adversity. Because if you're a boxing promoter, unlike other businesses, you hit pitfalls every step of the way, and you got to be able to get up, get past it, get to the next guy. Bob Arum started with Muhammad Ali. When Muhammad Ali retired, people said, "Oh, that's the end of Bob Arum." No, he had Oscar De La Hoya. And when De La Hoya retired, "Oh, that's the end of Bob Arum." No, he had Eric Morales. "Oh, that's the end of Bob Arum." No, here comes Manny Pacquiao. He has the ability to keep going because he knows he's so good at being a promoter. And the same thing with Don King. When Don King lost Julio Cesar Chavez, then he had, Frankie Randall. He had, he also had Larry Holmes early on. So the next pay-per-view guy to keep the thing going, and they both had it. Don for a couple of decades, Bob for 6.
It's incredible, and it is really that relentless nature that they both shared. I'm curious to your thoughts too in terms of the similarities and differences. One thing I feel like both of them do have that is similar is if you are a fighter promoted by Bob Arum or Don King, you have a feeling that they're going to defend you and get your back, and maybe at all costs, and maybe even if it's delusional, they'll still get your back. And it's almost like you remember the clip of Don King sitting next to Mike Tyson saying, well, the count when he knocked down Buster Douglas is 13 seconds. It should have been a knockout for Tyson. And we've seen Bob Arum so many times defend his fighters. And so I'm just wondering if you think that's part of their success. If you're a fighter that's going to sign with either man, you say, hey, well, this guy's going to have my back, and that's something that is going to appeal to a fighter.
Absolutely, and they go all out to do that.
Yeah.
But interestingly, when Buster Douglas knocked out Mike Tyson and Don protested it, Bob Arum defended Don, and he was with him on that protest. But yes, you're absolutely right. And part of the hard part of being a promoter is sometimes you get people sniping from all directions.
Yes.
The media, even your own fighters sometimes. A little bit of sniping at your back. But the biggest difference between the two, and I talked about the similarities, but the biggest difference between the two is that Don King, as he was brilliant, he had to control kind of everything that happened in the promotion. He knew what was in every contract. He was probably the only one who did. And you had people working in matchmaking, and you had people working in legal, but Don was on top of all that too. He had his hands on everything. Bob Arum, by contrast, has good people, and he trusts them to do what needs to be done. He trusts Carl Moretti to handle boxing operations. He trusts Brad Jacobs to handle the events themselves and the production of them. He trusts his great Hall of Fame matchmakers, Bruce Trampler and Brad Goodman, to do what they need to do. He trusts me to do television.
Right.
That's why Top Rank has the longevity it has. He gave Todd DeBuff the reins. He became the new president. He trusted his stepson to become the new president of Top Rank. And Carl and Todd has become a brilliant boxing businessman in his own right. Yeah. The deal with ESPN. He was one of the first to recognize the importance of social media, and he got Top Rank at the top of boxing social media. So trust the people you put in position to do their jobs. That's Bob Arum all over Don King. That's why Top Rank is up here and Don's kind of quieted down slightly.
That was my exact question, because so you mentioned the Top Rank team, supremely talented team, Brad Jacobs, Carl Moretti, yourself, like we mentioned, quality top-notch people at these positions. So in a way, you're saying Bob's skill has been to have that relentless nature himself and then delegate to the right people, and that's almost been a difference between him and Arum. Between him and Don King, and that's why we're still seeing Top Rank shows on the regular versus Don King, who's still doing shows here and there, but it's not nearly as consistent or at the level that Top Rank's doing. Is that right?
That's been my experience. That Bob Arum is a master of putting the right people in the right positions, and so the company has a great future, and Top Rank has evolved in a way that Don King Productions didn't.
It's the job of a promoter is actually a lot more difficult than people realize, because yes, you're signing fighters, but then there's so many things that can go wrong. A training camp, a fighter could get hurt. If a main event fighter gets hurt, everyone in the arena who bought tickets is entitled to a refund. That could screw up your media deal, right? Because they wanted a specific fight. You have to work with fighters on the undercards and personalities, and there's managers and hangers on. How did, there's so much stress in that role. How did both Arum and King deal with the stress of the role and there's so many different people that get involved in a boxer's training camp, not just the boxer himself?
One of the chapters in the beginning of the book, one of the early chapters, is on what is a promoter and what does it take to be a promoter? Because I've been asked over the years, really, what is a promoter and what do they do? I came up with an analogy that I like.
Okay.
Doing a promotion is like trying to set up a shaky card table for important guests. You got 4 shaky legs on this table. One leg is the fighter. You got to convince the fighter and his camp and his people that this is the right fight for him at this time in his career, and you should trust me and be my fighter. Then there's the broadcaster. You got to tell the broadcaster, this is a good fight for you on your programming schedule. You want this fight, and you got to set that shaky leg up. Third is the venue. This is a great for you. Your people are going to love this. You're going to sell a lot of tickets. This is going to be a great fight for your venue. And the fourth shaky leg is the public. You got to tell the public you want to watch this event, despite the 1,000 other things that they could watch on that night, all the other choices. And all 4 of these shaky legs have to stay up, or the whole event is going to come over. There's a lot of cards on that table. And it happens all the time, like you said. When Tyson went to fight Selden the first time, he had a broken thumb, and that was the end of that for a while. when there's so many fights have had something come up at the last minute. And as a good promoter, you got to be able to shake it off, get back up, and get the ship sailing again. And that's one thing both of these promoters were very good at. Look at the first big promotion for Don King, the Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire in 1974. That fight almost didn't happen because there was an injury while they were in Zaire. Foreman, injured his shoulder, and they wanted to postpone the fight. And Mobutu said, "You're not leaving. We have this fight scheduled. We put up $10 million for this fight. You can't leave." So they were all now very concerned about their freedom. And he had to persevere and get that fight back on track, and the fight eventually happened. It was one of the greatest fights of all time.
Speaking of you mentioned Don King there and putting fights together. I wonder how, I don't know if the right word is ingenuity. How much do you have to have of that as a promoter in this time? Because the stories are, for example, for Don King, he would go to a location and say, "Hey, I can bring you Muhammad Ali. I can bring you George Foreman," without actually having them sign. Then he would go to them and say, "Hey, I got the location if you'll come." It's almost like working backwards, and you're taking a little bit of a leap of faith, but you're making something happen in a non-traditional way. And I feel like in boxing, you almost have to do that. What do you think about the ingenuity needed by both men to be successful?
In order to be a successful promoter, you have to be creative. You have to be persistent. You have to have, look at the start with Don King. He started on HBO, and he had a deal with HBO. When that deal ended, HBO thought they had him in a take it or leave it situation, and he said to them, HBO offered Don King much less than he wanted. He had Tyson, and he thought he was going to get a huge payday, and they said, "No, we're going to give you this." And when you offer Don King an option that he doesn't like, he's going to give you a counteroffer you hate worse. So he left. And he went to Tony Cox, the head of Showtime at that time, who was a distant second to HBO. And he said, "If you trust me, I'll make you the biggest network in boxing." And he kept his word. Tony Cox took Don as a partner. And in 4 years, Showtime had the top 3 pay-per-view events of all time with Tyson. So you got to be creative. You got to navigate the waters. You
got to navigate the water. Speaking of that, Bob Arum, right? We know that boxing was on network TV for a long time, and then for such a long time, HBO and Showtime. And we know more recently, Bob Arum said, "Hey, I'm taking my product to ESPN." So a bigger, global audience in terms of subscribers, things like that, a bigger audience. So that was also a big move. What do you think about Bob Arum? Same thing, navigating those waters and making those changes, even though you're so used to maybe seeing your product in one place. You've got to be able to just be agile, right?
Change with the times. You have to evolve. When Bob Arum started in 1966, we had pay-per-views were really closed circuit events in movie theaters. And he was on, over-the-air television on CBS. And then his first ESPN fight was in 1980. And then he did a series with ESPN every Friday night. Then he wound up, on cable TV. Then there were the pay premiere channels like HBO and Showtime. So you got to change with the times. And then eventually he went back to ESPN. And now if the ESPN deal doesn't continue after July, he'll find another way to continue. Now that boxing and television have evolved into streaming services, OTT, over the top they call it, he will evolve with that time. All I know for sure is that whatever is good for the boxing fan, that's what Bob will do. That's what he's always done. Yeah,
it's all about just reinventing yourself with the modern times. You mentioned the differences and similarities between Bob Arum and Don King. What was their relationship like with each other? Because for a long time, they're obviously competitors. I know more recently, they're very divided in terms of their political outlook. So there's been some tension there. But what was their relationship like in the beginning, and how did it evolve?
They both have said the same thing in various times, that if it's a good deal, if it makes sense, we can work together. We can work, I can work with anybody. A good story that's in the book about I can work with anybody. People may not realize that Bob Arum was the promoter for Evel Knievel's Snake Canyon River Jump.
Wow.
Bob promoted that.
I didn't know that.
And when he first met Evel Knievel said to Bob Arum's face, he says, "I hate Jews, New Yorkers, and lawyers." And Bob said, "Well, I got the trifecta there." And he said, "But I can work with anybody." And he did. Bob and Don have worked together when they needed to. The last fight they did together, which I was involved with, was when Mayorga fought Cotto. And I sat the two of them down together to do an interview. And so when it makes sense, they do it. And now they both say, you know, I never liked the guy, but they give each other credit for what they've accomplished. And they're just, you know, a couple of old lions who, when they had to, they, you know, they went hunting together.
There must be just an innate mutual respect for each other, saying, hey, you're still in this game, I'm still in this game, look at all the things we've done in this sport, we put our footprint on it. For your work, in terms of everything you've done, why was this the time to write this book? Why did you say, hey, I want to share these stories, and why now?
Because I'm getting older, and I thought, let me write these stories down before I forget them.
Okay.
Because what the publisher liked about the book, Roman and Littlefield is the publisher of this book. They said, you know, we don't do a lot of boxing books anymore, but this one was different. From the perspective of a TV producer, that's a different angle we haven't seen before. So they liked that. And it started out with me putting down some of the stories, not just of Bob and Don and their accomplishments, but also of traveling the world for these two guys for the last 30 plus years. My best friend in the world, Colonel Bob Sheridan, was play-by-play for Don King for his whole career, and then I brought him over to Top Rank near the end of his career, and there are some funny stories about stuff that's happened to us behind the scenes. So it's not just the biography of these two gentlemen, although that's the primary focus, but I talk about my life and the evolution of television over the 40 years I've been in it, and some of the funny behind-the-scenes stories, and fights that almost didn't happen. Like, just very quickly, when Bernard Hopkins fought Segundo Mercado for a world championship in Quito, Ecuador in 1994. I produced and directed that fight for Showtime because they didn't go down to Ecuador. I fed that on to Showtime. That fight almost didn't happen. Our equipment, 40,000 pounds of equipment, arrived in Quito, Ecuador, and they weren't going to let it through customs. They said, oh, this much has never gotten through customs. So we had a coordinator friend named Jose Francisco Hernandez Limon, Pancho Limon, a 7-foot, 480-pound Mexican who came to coordinate and translate for me. And in customs, he said to the gentleman in charge of customs, he says, we have to get this through. And the man said, it cannot happen, it's not possible. So Pancho pulls out his phone and the man pulls his arm down. He says, no, I'm not. And I said, Pancho, what's happening? He says, well, I told him I need to call the president of Ecuador, and tell him that his champion cannot be seen on television because we cannot get the equipment through customs. And the man said, okay, no problem, we'll put everything through today. I said, Pancho, how did you get the president's number? He says, I don't even know his name.
Wow, incredible. To close it out, I feel like what we learn a little bit, as you know, from this book, Bob Arum and Don King, yes, they were able to promote boxing at the highest level, but they're from very different backgrounds, very different people. Right. And I'm just curious to your thoughts of what does that say about how work ethic can take you, being creative, as we talked about, being relentless, right? All of these qualities, being someone who can sell something, a salesman, a showman. What does it say that two people from very different backgrounds were able to have success in this sport?
The personality traits and the abilities that are necessary for promoting, doesn't matter where you came from. And they did come from very different backgrounds. You know, Bob, a scholar, a law scholar, and brilliant. He was in the Robert Kennedy's Department of Justice. And his first association with boxing was he had to go confiscate the purses for the first Patterson Liston fight. And that's how he first was introduced to boxing. Don King was coming out of prison after a manslaughter charge. And he had Muhammad Ali doing a benefit for a Cleveland hospital. That's how he started. Doesn't matter where you started, they both wound up at the pinnacle of boxing because of their skills, their abilities, their desires, and their unique abilities to perform well in this particular job, which is one of the hardest jobs I've ever seen.
Certainly, it's a very difficult job and so much behind the scenes that people don't realize. Before we close it out, anything else that people should know about this book, anything else that you want to share to the audience that is looking at this book?
The only other thing about it is there's also a little history. For people that are just casual boxing fans, I give the history of boxing going back to the 3,000 years ago to the Cenarians. and the first use of the word boxing in 1719 when James Figg became the first boxing champion, the Marquess of Queensberry rules in 1876, and the history of boxing, how it got to be where it is. So there's a little something for everybody, a little history, a little funny stories about the travel, stuff about television, and all the boxing history. And even if you're a boxing purist and you know these old fights, there may be something about those fights you didn't know, like the fact that Bob Arum's very first promotion was Ali against George Chuvalo in Toronto, and that fight, he says, was the hardest event he ever did. 10,000 fights later, he says his first event was the hardest he ever did. It's an interesting story, I think, even for boxing purists.
Looking forward to checking it out. So if people are interested, I'm sure they are after hearing these stories, where can they get a copy of this book?
I can get it on Amazon. There are a few other places, but you can get it on Amazon. It officially releases on February 18th, but you can get pre-sale orders right now.
Marty Corwin, thank you so much for the time. Congratulations. Arum and King is available now. It's on Amazon, 6 Decades of Boxing Gold. You just heard some of the great stories there. So many more packed in this book. So I encourage everyone listening to check it out, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Curran.